Welcome to our new book, Otis Spofford by Beverly Cleary. Otis is the main character. You'll get to know him, and he's kind of the class clown, the pest, kind of a troublemaker, but everyone still loves him. So let's read and find out about Otis. Chapter 1, Otis Gets His Man. There was nothing Otis liked better than stirring up a little excitement. Otis was a medium-sized boy with reddish-brown hair, freckles, and ears that stuck out. He often wore a leather jacket with a rabbit's foot tied to the zipper, and he always laced his shoes with the kind of laces that glow in the dark, pink for the right shoe and green for the left. Otis found it hard to stir up any excitement around home. He was sure it would be easier if he had lived in a house with a yard to play in, like the other boys and girls in room 11 at Rosemont School. Instead, he lived with his mother, Valerie Todd Spofford, in an apartment. Mrs. Spofford was away from home most of the time teaching ballet and tap dancing lessons at the Spofford School of the Dance over the Payless drugstore. Otis wished his mother had more time to spend at home so that Mrs. Brewster, the manager of the apartment house, would not have to keep an eye on him. Mrs. Spofford was never very cross with Otis for wanting to stir up a little excitement, but Mrs. Brewster, she made it plain that she did not like dirt, dogs, or noise, and that she stood for no nonsense from boys. School, however, was different. Except for learning things, Otis liked school. He could find so many ways to stir up excitement. Once a week, Otis's teacher, Mrs. Gittler, took her class to the auditorium for folk dancing. Otis was the only member of the class who did not like this period. I'd rather play dodgeball any day, he always thought, as they marched down the hall. I see enough dancing at the Spofford School of Dance. The class had learned several dances like stupid one hopping on one foot, and I lost my way in the gooseberry bushes. But for the past few weeks they had been practicing a Mexican folk dance for the Fiesta. Rosemont School was planning for a parent-teacher association meeting. Each class in the school was given a Mexican dance. Afterward, the mothers in the PTA would sell cookies and punch to raise money for visual aids for the school. Otis was not the least bit excited about the Fiesta. He was sure that the PTA would rather see a good ball game. There were 3 more boys than girls in the class. This meant that 2 boys had to dance together, one of them, against his wishes, taking the part of a girl. The 3rd boy danced alone. Otis was usually the 3rd boy. No one wanted him for a partner because he liked to hop on his right foot when he was supposed to hop on his left. This was hard on a partner's toes. He didn't care if no one wanted to dance with him, and today, as he went through the steps alone, he amused himself by dancing stiff-legged. Mrs. Gittler stopped the phonograph. "Otis, be a gentleman," she said. "Mrs. Gittler, I don't see why I have to be in the old Fiesta," complained Otis. "There are too many boys in the class anyway." "Me too," said Stewie Hicks promptly. "Leave it to old Stewie," thought Otis. And here he is. You can definitely spot out which one is Otis Spofford. That was the trouble with Stewie. He liked to get on whatever excitement Otis was stirring up. To Otis's surprise, Mrs. Gittler smiled and said, "I have a different plan for the 3 extra boys." Now what? Wondered Otis, thinking he might get into something worse than folk dancing. "We're going to have a bullfight in the center of the circle of the dancers. One boy will be a toreador, and the other 2 will wear a bull costume." Mrs. Gittler paused while the class laughed at the thought of the 2 boys dressed up like a bull. At the end of the dance, when the toreador wins and the bull falls down, the girls will all take flowers out of their hair and toss them at the toreador. Otis was pleased with this idea. He could see himself dressed up like a bullfighter, wearing his red cape in front of the bull, and stepping nimbly aside when the bull charged at him. He would bow to the crowd while the girls showered him with the flowers and the audience cheered. Maybe he was going to like the fiesta after all. Mrs. Gittler spoiled his daydream by saying, "Otis, since you do not care about folk dancing, you may be half the bull." The class laughed. "The front half or the back half?" Otis wanted to know. "The front half," answered Mrs. Gittler. "Stewart, you may be the other half. George, you may be the toreador or bullfighter." Otis could see that George felt pretty good about being the toreador. Oh, well, thought Otis, being the front half of the bull was not so bad. It was better than folk dancing, and he and Stewie ought to have fun. Then Mrs. Gittler had the three boys practicing bullfighting. Stewie put his hands on Otis's hips, and the other two boys charged at George, who twirled an imaginary cape in front of them. While George pretended to stab the bull with a sword, Otis and Stewie fell to the floor. "All right, Otis," said Mrs. Gittler. "I don't think it is necessary for the bull to die with his front feet in the air. Falling to the floor is enough." Otis lay on the floor and watched George bow as the girls pretended to throw flowers at him. He thought George looked very pleased with himself. When the bell rang for recess, Otis followed George around singing, "Toreadora, don't spit on the flora. Use the cuspadora, that's what it's a-for." Of course Stewie joined in. Otis was a little disappointed when George only grinned and said, "Keep quiet." When the afternoon of the fiesta finally arrived, all Rosemont School bustled with excitement. The teachers wore white blouses, long full skirts, and flowers in their hair. Even Mr. Howe, the principal, wore a Mexican hat and a red sash. While the ladies of the PTA worked to get the cookie and punch booths ready on the playground, the teachers worked to get the children ready inside the classrooms. Mrs. Gittler's face was flushed. She was hurriedly fastening paper stripes down the legs of the boys' jeans with Scotch tape. Otis and Stewie already wore the leg parts of their costume, which looked like pajama pants made out of gunny sacks. They were practicing walking like a bull. Otis had worked out a few variations like skipping backward. He could hardly wait to get the top part of the costume. The girls, who were wearing white blouses and full skirts with crepe paper ruffles basted around the hems, were busy pinning flowers in their hair. "Now, Curtis, I want you to behave yourself," said Mrs. Gittler as she started to tie crepe paper sashes around the boys' waists. Otis, who had not done a thing yet, felt a little guilty. How did Mrs. Gittler know he was looking around for a little excitement to stir up? Otis watched Ellen Tibbetts tug a lock of her hair, and he heard her say to Augustine Allen, "I wish my hair would hurry up and grow long enough for pigtails." Then she tipped her head back and shook her hair so it brushed against the back of her neck. "Feels longer when I do this," she explained. Otis enjoyed teasing Ellen more than anybody. He did not know what it was about her that made him feel that way. Maybe it was because she was so neat and clean and well behaved, or maybe it was because he knew he could always make her mad. Now he tipped his head back in imitation of Ellen. "I wish my hair would grow long enough for pigtails," he said in a squeaky voice. "Oh, for goodness sakes," snapped Ellen. "Oh, for gunny sacks," said Otis. He was pleased when everybody laughed. "Oh, for gunny sacks," he repeated to get another laugh. Then Otis stopped teasing Ellen because the door opened and George walked into the room wearing his toreador suit. Otis stared with the rest of the class. There were no jeans with paper stripes for George. He was wearing black velvet knee pads and a velvet hat that Otis had seen one of the PTA ladies making out of an old dress. Around his shoulders was a splendid cape that no one would ever guess had been The skirt of someone's evening dress stuck through his green sash. He wore a short wooden sword. George did not walk. He swaggered. Adios, he said grandly. Chili con carne, answered Otis, using the only Spanish phrase he knew. He had learned it from cans that his mother sometimes opened for lunch when she was in a hurry. He sure thinks he's smart, observed Stewie. I wish Mrs. Gittler would hurry up and let us have the top of our bull costume, remarked Otis, who did not like to see George getting all the attention. But Mrs. Gittler was in no hurry to have a four-legged animal running around her classroom. Otis grew more impatient as she finished the boys' sashes and began to hand out tambourines to the girls. When she ran out of tambourines, she distributed old milk cartons filled with pebbles. The lucky girls with tambourines banged them happily, while the girls who had to take milk cartons sulked. Otis noticed that Ellen, who was one of the best pupils in his mother's dancing classes, had a tambourine and was practicing steps she had learned at the Spofford School of the Dance, while Otis was trying to think of a way to tease Ellen some more. George swaggered by and looked scornfully at Otis and Stewie's burlap trousers. Adios, he scoffed. Old fancy pants, muttered Otis, and began to sing, Toreador, don't spit on the floor. All right, Otis and Stewart, said Mrs. Gittler, you may go to the auditorium for the rest of your costume. Oh, boy, shouted Otis, as the two boys raced out of the room. And no running in the halls, called Mrs. Gittler. Of course they paid no attention. The PTA ladies helped Otis and Stewart into the top of the costume. Otis's end had a head with a fine pair of horns made out of rolled-up cardboard. Stewie's half had a tail made of rope fringed at the end. The head was fastened to a stick that Otis held inside the bull's burlap body. It was dark inside the bull, but Otis could see where he was going because there was a peephole under the bull's jaw. Otis was satisfied when the ladies laughed at him and Stewie in their costume. He made the bull nod its head, paw the ground, and run out of the auditorium and down the hall. Now maybe he could stir up a little excitement. The class shouted with laughter when they saw the animal. Otis felt someone pat his head, which looked like the bull's shoulder from the outside, and heard Tommy say, How's old Ferdinand? Through his peephole, Otis saw that George paid no attention. He was too busy twirling his cape. All right, boys and girls, said Mrs. Gittler. Let's get in line. It's time for the parade. Come on, George. You go first. Bull, you're next. Find your partners, everybody. Otis could not resist poking George in the seat of his velvet pants with the bull's horns. Old fancy pants, he thought. Cut this out, said George. Come along, people, said Mrs. Gittler as she led the way out of the classroom. All the classes in the school paraded around the playground, which was supposed to be a village square. The mothers sat on the bleachers on three sides of the square. The baseball backstop covered with crepe paper was on the fourth side. In front of it was a platform with several chairs, a phonograph, or what we knew is a radio, a record player, and a microphone. When Otis saw the audience, he was carried away. Now he could stir up a little excitement. He made the bull nod and bow and paw the ground. When everyone laughed, he made the bull wave. This was difficult to do because he had to stand on one foot while he waved the other. The audience laughed harder. Otis began to skip, and Stewie had to follow. You cut that out, ordered George. You're supposed to walk behind me. Otis lowered the bull's head and started to charge, but by the time the class had come to its section of chairs in front of the bleachers, everyone sat down except Otis and Stewie, who had to stand up. Mrs. Gittler leaned over and whispered to Otis through his peephole, Some of the mothers can't see over you. Maybe you boys had better wait behind the backstop until our turn. We come on after the kindergarten does its Mexican cowboy dance. The bull trotted behind the backstop, where Otis could hear the principal welcoming the mothers. George sure thinks he's something, said Stewie. Who does he think he is giving us orders? Otis wanted to know. He rubbed his ears where the burlap scratched him and thought what a good joke it would be on George if he could think of a way to keep him from being the whole show. We ought to do something about him, said Stewie. I'm thinking, said Otis. The bull leaned against the backstop while the president of the PTA welcomed the mothers. Hey, I know what, exclaimed Otis and whispered to Stewie. That's a super idea, agreed Stewie. Let's go. The boys took off the top half of their costume and hid it under a pile of papers. Crouching low, they ran out from behind the backstop and around to some empty seats in the 6th grade section. Everyone was listening to a member of the school board welcome the mothers, and no one paid attention to Otis and Stewie, who were careful to sit very still. They continued to sit still while the kindergarten did its Mexican cowboy dance. They scarcely breathed as they watched Mrs. Gittler go behind the backstop and look around for the missing bull. They slid down in their chairs and grinned at each other while their whole class stood up to look for them. Otis was especially pleased with George's worried look. This ought to show him that without a bull to fight, he didn't amount to much. When the audience became restless because of the delay, Otis and Stewie exchanged glances. Now, whispered Otis, and the two boys began to stamp their feet and clap their hands. The older boys around them joined in, while others began to whistle for the show to go on. Soon all the boys in the school were stamping, clapping, or whistling. Otis and Stewie exchanged satisfied looks. They had started even more noise than they expected. Well, we'll let them look a little longer, said Otis. Quiet, roared the principal into the microphone. When the noise subsided, he said, I am disappointed to learn that the boys of Rosemont School do not know how to behave like gentlemen. Hey, look, whispered Stewie. They're beginning without us. The class was moving toward the center of the playground. This was not part of the plan. We better get going, Otis told Stewie as they started back where they belonged. They pulled out the top of the bull costume and scrambled into it. They were not going to miss performing in the bull suit if they could help it. All right, snapped Mrs. Gittler when she saw them. You boys get into place in a hurry. I'll deal with you later. Come on, hurry up, ordered George. Moo, answered Otis. When Mrs. Gittler started the phonograph or record player, George swaggered onto the playground with the bull tagging along behind. The rest of the class followed and took positions of the circle painted on the cement. Then they began to dance. Partners faced each other, slid to the right, stamped their feet, and slid to the left. The girls jingled their tambourines and rattled their milk cartons in time to the music. Through his peephole, Otis could see George standing in the center, waving his cape. Suddenly he had a wonderful idea. It was so good he wondered why he hadn't thought of it sooner. Now he would really stir up something. Hey, Stewie, he whispered, we're going to catch it anyways. So, let's have some fun. Okay, agreed Stewie. Otis whispered his plan, and Stewie snorted with laughter. Let's start out with chasing our tail, directed Otis. I mean your tail, he added, since the tail really belonged to Stewie. As Otis and Stewie ran around in a circle, the audience began to laugh. Otis could see the class did not like having people laugh while they were dancing. Several got out of step and had to hop on one foot to get in step again. Now Otis and Stewie lay down on the cement. The audience laughed harder. George advanced, scowling and waving his cape. Otis gave the signal, and he and Stewie stood up and began to skip backward. Cut out the funny business, said George. My cape is supposed to make you mad. Otis lowered the bull's head and charged. George stepped aside as the bull rushed through the cape. Then Otis turned sharply and poked George in the seat of the pants with his horns. Hey, yelled George, and the audience howled. You cut that out. You're not supposed to do that. Enjoying himself thoroughly, Otis skipped merrily around the circle of dancers and prepared to charge again, while the girls, banging their tambourines and rattling their milk cartons, danced around their partners. Boy, he's really mad now, thought Otis as he watched George through his peephole. This is really good. Once more, George flapped his cape. The bull ran past it, and Otis started to poke the toreador again. But this time, George was too quick. He pulled a sword out of his belt and gave back the end of the bull a good hard swat with the side of his wooden blade. Yow! Came a voice from the middle of the bull. The toreador swatted again. Yow! Yelled the middle of the bull again. The audience screamed with laughter. By this time, every one of the dancers was out of step. Hey, Otis, said Stewie, let's cut this out. That hurt. Too late now, answered Otis, lowering the head for another charge. He was having too much fun to stop now. There was nothing for Stewie to do but follow. This time, Otis managed to poke the toreador again. George grabbed the bull by the tail and swatted with his sword. Ouch, yelled Stewie. Otis, Spofford, you cut this out. Hang on, ordered Otis. We'll get him this time. I'll get you for this, retorted Stewie. Just because you're the front end. The bull jerked its tail out of the toreador's hands and charged so fast that George did not have a chance to get out of the way. George tripped. Otis pushed so hard that he bent the bull's horns, and the toreador lay flat on the cement. Otis spotted his right foot in the middle of the toreador's green sash, while the audience clapped and shouted. Delighted with the commotion he was causing, Otis made the bull bow to the right and to the left. He felt George struggling to get up, so he pushed his foot down harder as he bowed once more to the audience. The class gave up trying to dance. Everyone stopped to watch the victorious bull. Aren't we supposed to throw our flowers? Asked one of the girls. You let me up. George wiggled under the bull's foot. You just wait, muttered Stewie inside the burlap behind Otis. The girls pulled the flowers out of their hair and tossed them at the bull. Otis, Spofford, hissed Mrs. Gittler. Otis could not resist one more bow. Then he took his foot off the toreador, and the bull trotted out of the ring in a shower of petals. George got up and angrily brushed himself off. Mrs. Gittler was waiting for Otis and Stewie. She snatched off the top of their costume. Now you boys sit on those 2 chairs and don't you dare move until the program is over, she said grimly. Otis was not worried. He knew that Mrs. Gittler never stayed cross with him very long. Satisfied with the excitement he had caused, he took a deep breath of fresh air. It had been hot and stuffy inside the bull. It was all his idea, growled Stewie, rubbing the seat of his pants. I'll get him for that, said George. Quiet, ordered Miss Gittler. Otis, Spofford, one of these days you're going to go too far. Who, me? asked Otis innocently. Yes, you, said his teacher. Someday, Otis, you're going to get your come-uppance. What's a come-uppance? asked Otis. You'll find out, answered Miss Gittler. That old Otis Spofford spoiling our dance, said Ellen, as she slid past him to sit down. Otis knew he was safe for a while. There was nothing the 2 boys could do but glower at him for the rest of the program. Stewie did manage a couple of sideways kicks, but that was all. Otis decided he might as well leave as soon as the program ended. There was really no reason why he should stay around for punch and cookies. But when the time came, the 3 boys and their teacher were surrounded by smiling mothers. Now I'll catch it, thought Otis. Oh well, it was worth it. The way things turned out, it had been even more fun than a ball game. What a clever act you planned, exclaimed one of the mothers to Miss Gittler. And so original, having the bull win, added another. Mrs. Gittler looked startled. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Well, how do you like that, thought Otis, laughing to himself. They think that was the way the bullfight was supposed to be. Boy, oh boy, is this a good joke. We enjoyed it so much, murmured some more mothers. This time Mrs. Gittler managed to smile as she said, Why, thank you. I don't know how I've managed. I don't know when I've laughed so hard, said another mother. I'm so glad you enjoyed our program. Mrs. Gittler responded graciously. But Mrs. Gittler, protested George. I was supposed to. Never mind now, George, said Mrs. Gittler. We'll talk about it later. But, said George. I said never mind, repeated Miss Gittler. You heard what the teacher said, Otis put in. I guess you think you're pretty smart, muttered George. Well, aren't I? Asked Otis cockily. You just wait, said Stewie. Otis saw his mother coming through the crowd. She put her arm around him and said, You performed beautifully. I was proud of my boy. Otis grinned at the other two boys, who glared back. I must hurry or I'll be late for my ballet class, Miss Spofford said. Be a good boy and go right home. Sure, answered Otis, thinking his mother would be surprised if she knew just how quickly he planned to go home. When Mrs. Spofford left, Otis felt there was no reason to hang around any longer. He ducked out of the crowd and headed for home as fast as he could run. 2 pairs of feet came pounding down the sidewalk after him. You just wait, yelled Stewie and George. Terrador! Terradora! Sang Otis at the top of his voice. After all, he had a good head start.